fighting amongst humans has been going on from the very beginning, right? Or just about from the very beginning. So long as there are two people, people fight. It's just how it is. And there are many reasons for people to fight. And you could go down the list of them, especially those of you who are or have been married before. There are lots of reasons to fight, aren't there? We set that aside. One of the main ones, though, is tribalism. Tribalism divides us from each other. Tribalism puts a barrier between me and another person. Tribalism blinds us from seeing other people the way that we should. And tribalism often inspires violence in people. We've seen that as recently as this past election cycle, as both sides down the political spectrum hurl insults and vulgaries at each other, as people want to take up arms against their own countrymen because they disagree politically. We've seen that as recently as last month. Tribalism, we saw it in the days of Martin Luther King Jr. and his assassination and the brutal violence enacted upon him and against other people of color during his day. We saw tribalism in the very framing of our Constitution, where women and slaves weren't even counted as whole citizens, not given the same privileges and rights that white land-owning men were given in our country. And the failure of our framers led to a war in our own country, North and South, fighting against each other. Tribalism at its heart is nothing but antithetical to the way of the gospel. It should be fairly obvious at this point how deeply I hate tribalism. I understand the pull that we all feel. We all have it to be around like-minded people. Every single one of us feels that pull. There's a natural tendency to isolate ourselves from others who don't look, sound, or think the way that we do. But as Christians, we have to reject such base urges within us, because they do not serve the cause of Christ. Tribalism doesn't help us. It hurts us in every way imaginable. We've all been victims to moments where we weren't quite sure that we fit in with the people we were around. We've all been in situations where we seem to be the odd person out. How does it feel? It feels great, doesn't it? Of course not. Far from it. So when we do the same thing to others, when we act in tribalistic ways, when we separate ourselves from other people based on whatever criteria you want to use, we inject that same feeling of loneliness and isolation into them and into that situation. As Christians, we have to rise above that and do better. And there's a story in Luke 10 that we're about to read, the story of the Good Samaritan, that I believe speaks to this truth. It's a story that places love and mercy front and center. A story that every person alive, I think, can learn from. So let's read and see what it has to say to us. Beginning in verse 25 of Luke chapter 10, the word of the Lord from Luke's Gospel. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him. "Do this, and you will live." The man wanted to justify his action, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by him. A temple assistant, a Levite, walked over and looked at him lying there. He also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, and I both love and hate this response, because it's almost as if the religious leader can't bring himself to say, the Samaritan. And at the same time, he rightly describes the Samaritan, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Or go and do likewise, as many of your translations probably say. Okay, it's not showing up here on this monitor, so I'm going to have you just go to the next slide for me and go ahead and pull up the first bullet point. Thank you. Because I don't know what I wouldn't be able to tell. So go and do likewise. Let's start by talking about the most important command first. There's an irony here in this story, which at first I think seems hidden, but is made more explicit by how Luke sets up this story in chapter 10. I know I started reading in verse 25, and that was just to kind of cut down on so much reading. But I think it would behoove us a little bit to jump back to verse 21. So do that with me for a moment. So I want to see what Jesus said there. What Jesus said in verse 21 is, thank you. And he's speaking to the Lord here. He's speaking to his Father. Thank you for hiding these things. What are these things? They are the truths about Jesus and his mission in this world. Thank you for hiding these things from those who think themselves wise and clever, and for revealing them to the childlike. Who is the religious leader who comes to Jesus only 4 verses later? One who thinks himself wise and clever. One who thinks he has all of the answers already at his fingertips. One who's asking this question of Jesus not for a real answer, not because he thinks Jesus has anything important or good to say, but because he wants to catch Jesus, trip him up, make him look foolish, because this man is so wise and clever. And a mere few verses before, Jesus prays to God, thank you for hiding these things from such people. They're not deserving of it yet. Now, everybody ultimately can be let in on this secret of who Jesus is. But those who think they have all the answers, those who come to Jesus assuming they have all the answers, are the very people from whom the truth about Jesus is and will remain hidden. Until you humble yourself. Until you stop assuming that you know everything, the truth of Jesus will be hidden from you. Folks, that's a little bit scary to me. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm just a smidge arrogant. Sometimes I find myself thinking that I have all the answers. I assume that I'm wise and clever. Maybe what I need to do is be humble and assume that I don't know everything. Though Jesus isn't the one who directly boils down the law and the prophets here, he allows that religious leader to do it on his own, that loving God and loving neighbor is the greatest command. It's clear that Jesus agrees with him, and he believes this as well. And he's not the first teacher to do something like this, where they take a huge range of topics and teachings and boil it down to a handful of things and say, here's what you need to take away ultimately from this teaching. It's always been a common practice for religious leaders to attempt to succinctly, and we have trouble with that, mind you. Of course, you all give me this platform, so, I'm going to take advantage of it. But religious leaders have trouble succinctly saying anything. Brevity is not our strong suit. We attempt to succinctly, though, deliver the truth of our message into an easily remembered and enacted teaching. That's what Jesus is doing. Though the teaching that he gives here may seem simple, the truth, I think, goes much deeper than the surface level. It's not known for sure when these two things get coupled together, love of God and love of neighbor. We don't know when they became so closely intertwined in Jewish thought. Some believe that it began with Jesus himself. However, there is some extra-biblical, meaning outside of the Bible, there is some evidence that maybe there are some other Jewish teachers who are already beginning to put these two things together. And the obviousness of these two things going together, to us now seems very obvious. But it was overlooked for how many centuries? That these two things might sum up the law and the prophets. The commands to love God and love neighbor are actually not found next to each other in the Old Testament. In the portion of Scripture that we call the Law of Moses, or the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy has the command to love God, like we read about it here in Luke, or at least a similar version of it. The command to love neighbor, though, is found in Leviticus. Well, in case you were missing what I was just saying, Deuteronomy and Leviticus are not the same book. They're different books. So in two different places, these two commands come from. So again, it seems obvious to us now that love God and love neighbor go hand in hand, but that's because we see Jesus saying that. Or we see him affirming it here in this story. The importance of this, though, is not whether you intellectually know that love of God and love of neighbor go together. It isn't even in whether you can directly quote where those verses might be found in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And I looked them up this week, and I still can't do that. Because that's not the point. The point isn't being able to directly quote them. The point is to be able to do what? Go and do likewise. The point of Jesus' teaching isn't to intellectually know it. It isn't to think yourself wise and clever. It is to put it into action. We often miss that. No doubt the religious leader to whom Jesus was speaking could have recited those verses word for word and all the other verses surrounding both of those verses. I have no doubt that if Jesus had quizzed him on how much he knew of Scripture, this man would have aced the quiz. But that's not the point. Jesus doesn't stop there and go, "You got it. That's it. That's perfect. I'm so proud of you." So what is important then? What does Jesus emphasize? Well, precisely what he says to him. Do this, and what? Then you will live. It's not a matter of intellectual exercise or assent to some theoretical proposition that Jesus demands of us. It's not about getting theology right. And this is somebody who's talking to you. I love theology. I love talking about those things. I love getting into the nitty-gritty of who is God and what does that mean? That can't be what Christianity is about. It has to be about more than that. It is about action. It's about doing. It's an agreement to follow through on our commitment of discipleship. And we can require tests, biblical knowledge tests all we want. We can require devotees of Jesus to recite Scripture as proof that they're taking their discipleship seriously. A quiz, a test doesn't really tell you who somebody is. It doesn't tell you what they really believe about Jesus. How do you know? How do you know that somebody is a Christian? They do what Jesus said to do. You're probably noticing a consistent theme in some of what I've said over the past few weeks. There's reasons for that, and it's not because I think it's important to emphasize. It's because Jesus continues to emphasize this over and over and over again. His words are not merely meant to be recited over and over again. His words are meant to be put into action. His life is meant to be modeled by His followers. And there's no better model. Oh, go to the next one. I forgot. It's not up here. There's no better model of this action than the one who showed mercy. The Samaritan, the unnamed Samaritan, the one that this religious leader couldn't even say, it was a Samaritan, he couldn't even mumble it. He just had to say, the one who showed mercy. So this same emphasis that I've been talking about is found in the story of the Good Samaritan as well. He's the one who showed mercy. And in showing mercy, the Samaritan showed that he was the one actually following the ways of Yahweh and not the established Jewish religious authorities. And to really understand this story, we have to understand the tribalism of that day. And this is how I started, because I think, for me, this is the heart of the story right now in my life. This idea of breaking down tribalism, I think, takes center stage in this story. The hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans had been going on for centuries. These people hate each other. And I don't just mean in the sort of, I don't want to be around that person a little bit. They actively hated and went to war with each other. Both groups, it comes from the fact that both groups believed they were the true inheritors of Abraham's lineage. Both the Jews and Samaritans believed that they directly descended from Abraham. And so they were the true inheritors of the promised land. They were the true inheritors of this truth passed down from God. Both had their own versions of the laws of Moses. There's still Samaritan Pentateuchs out there that you can read from. They are similar but differ slightly in their telling of the stories that we read in our own Bible. So the modern parallel, I think, would be something akin to the Israelis and the Palestinians still fighting over that narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean Sea. Two people that hate each other, both believing that they are inheritors of Abraham's lineage, both believing that they lay claim to this land. And that tribalism is still going on today. And this mentality, this tribal mentality, caused so many issues for the Jews and the Samaritans. It precipitated animosity and even violence between the two groups. So that by the time this moment comes around, that Jesus is telling the story about a Samaritan actually doing something good, the fact that a Jew would be telling a story about a Samaritan doing something positive for another person would have been so astronomically insane to the other Jews listening to Jesus tell this story. There's no way they could have believed that He's actually telling a story about a Samaritan being good. I think my guess is as they're listening to the story, they're expecting some kind of comedic punchline, right? Like the tables are going to turn at the last moment and the Samaritan's really going to be the butt of some elaborate joke rather than the one who's doing something good in the story. That's what they're waiting on. And that never comes because the Samaritan is the one who showed mercy. And the two religious leaders in this story, what can we say about them? Except that I think they resemble us a lot. Two people who are more concerned with religious purity, with looking and sounding right, than they are with doing right. Yes, they might have been impure if the man was actually dead on the side of the road. But to take that chance, or to not take that chance, that he might just be injured and that they can help him to care more about religious purity than they do about helping another person. This has everything we need to know about who they were. They would rather follow their religious purity laws than they would the law of God to love another fellow human being. And it would be naive to assume the Samaritan wasn't following a similar, if not almost identical set of ritual purity laws. As I said before, they had their own version of the law of Moses. Has their same sort of religious purity laws that he would have been bound by as well, and would have potentially made him ritually impure by going over to this injured man who could be dead. And if he touches him now, he's unclean. But it's the Samaritan who says, so what? It's the Samaritan who looks at the man and says, I can do something about this. I can help him. He was willing to help someone outside his own tribe when the two religious leaders weren't even willing to help someone within theirs. The failure of the religious leader and ourselves, this religious leader who comes to Jesus, is that we fail to realize everybody is in our tribe. That tribalism is made up by us to exclude and discount other people. Neighbor isn't defined by who is in our tribe. Everybody is our neighbor. And there's something so real and raw about that teaching. That even though we've read this story for 2,000 years, we continually fail. We continually fail to recognize or to at least let that truth sit and work on us. So I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many of you found yourselves a month ago getting angry at one side or the other political party? How many of you found yourselves, I hate that other side. They're so wrong and they're so dumb and I just want them to go away. We do that. We get ourselves worked up into a lather and we're just, we can't think straight, right? Because we bought into a mentality that tribalism is the way the world works. Instead of buying into the truth of the gospel, that tribalism isn't real. That our neighbor is everybody. And that regardless of who you are, you're my neighbor. You're somebody created in the image of God that I love. We can disagree about all sorts of things. I don't care about that. You're my neighbor. It's only the Samaritan that gets it. We are still failing to get it. And I think it's because we come in arrogance to the gospel. We come acting as though we have all the answers already. We believe ourselves so wise and clever that there's nothing to learn here anymore. Until we put away that arrogance, until we recognize that we are not so wise and clever, we will still fail to realize the truth of the gospel. This story demands more of us than just reading it as a nice little children's tale, teaching us a sweet little platitude. Jesus is just speaking to our precious little hearts to love other people. There's more to it. It goes deeper. We are still failing in our call to put away tribalism. Within our churches, within our friend groups, at work, we are still failing at this. And the church ought to be front and center leading the way, showing everybody else that tribalism doesn't work. that it only leads to hatred and violence. And yet Christians, or self-proclaimed Christians, let me say, have been at the very forefront of this tribalism mentality over the last several years. We don't want to recognize it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to admit to it or cop to it because that can't be us. But it is. It absolutely, fundamentally is. And I think it comes from arrogance. Jesus is telling us to be different than that. And so we must be. We have to be. Or the better world that we want for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren, it's not going to happen. Jesus demands that we see everyone, regardless of whether they're in our tribe or not, as our neighbor. That's the only way that the violence will end. That's the only way the backstabbing will end. That's the only way that hatred will end. We're all still working on this command. There's too much hatred and violence in our world still. Jesus demands for us to go and do likewise, to go and see everyone as our neighbor, like the Samaritan did, the hero of the story, the one who showed mercy. That's how the gospel will spread, through mercy, not violence, through love, not hatred. That's how the message of God's love and mercy and grace are going to be spread to all. And that's how people will know that we're truly changed by this gospel message. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to get the hatred out of people. I've been thinking a lot about that over the last several years. I don't know how to get corruption and hatred and violence out of people, but I want it gone. And I'm struggling with it. I don't know how we can continue to read a story like this and not see what Jesus wants us to see. There is no difference between you and I. Not in His eyes. We see color of skin. We see economic wealth. We see, disparity between social status and all those sort of things. It's not what God sees when He sees us. God sees me. He sees you. And He wants us to see each other that way as well. That Jesus could tell a story in His time to go and be like a Samaritan. No, Jesus is just saying all the wrong things. And that's what I love about Jesus. He's not interested in giving us the cutesy little stories that make us feel better. He's interested in changing our hearts, in changing our lives. And if you don't read a story like this and want your heart to change and want your life to change, then you're reading it wrong. If you're coming to the story thinking that you've already got all the answers, that you've already got it all figured out, then you're reading it wrong. You are like that religious leader who came to Jesus, thinking himself wise and clever. A couple of things to take away from today. There's a fiery one today. I love this story. It gets me going. I love this story so much. A couple of things to take away. Okay, you can put the first one up there. What is the greatest command in our society? And how does it compare to what Jesus said? I just want you to think about that for a moment. If you were to take a survey of people in our society, what would be the greatest command in our society? And how does that compare to what Jesus says? That the greatest command as Christians is to love God and love neighbor. My guess, and I thought a lot about this as I wrote the question, my guess is that there isn't a single answer that would look anything at all like the gospel. And I think that ought to trouble us. Not because I'm so concerned about making American society like a Christian society or anything like that, but because I see so many Christians who have married themselves to American society as though it were Christian society. The greatest commands of our American society, I don't think, have anything to do with the gospel. That's my suspicion about our society. All right, the second thing. How can we grow in our capacity for mercy and demonstrate it to others? I want to be like the Samaritan. And I think I'm a fairly merciful and generous person. And then I remember just how arrogant that sounds. And then I remember how non-humble that sounds. How can I be more merciful? Even if you think you are merciful, you're not there yet. You haven't got it all figured out. How can we be more merciful and actually demonstrate that to other people? All right, that's what I wanted to talk about from Luke chapter 10 today. There's obviously a lot more we could have gone into. There are more details of the story that are really great to look at. I mean, it's not just that the Samaritan takes care of the man. It's that he pays for everything and then says, hey, run up my credit card bill in the meantime until I come back. Like, let me go into debt for this man that I don't even know who was beat up on the side of the road. That's crazy. All right, anyway. Samaritan story is just such a great story. This is our family time as we close out our sermon to come together as a family, to pray for each other, to consider each other's needs, to celebrate if there's something really great going on in your life, to remember and the idea of family. I've thought a lot about it over the last few years as I'm so far away from mine, and Rachel's so far away from hers. Redefining family can be tough. But in you, we have found a family here, and that's been really special. And that's why I kind of transitioned about a year ago to doing this idea of like family time, thinking about what it means to be family and redefining that. It can be tough to share things that are on our heart. But I want to encourage you, if there's anything that you want or feel like you need to bring before us, don't hesitate to do that, because that's what we're here for. So let us know about those things as we stand and sing.